Hi, Sangeet. It's nice to speak to you. You've done some great work on platforms in the past, and I think among all the people who've kind of thought through and written about platforms, I think you're one of the clearest and most first principles kind of thinkers out there. And it's exciting because now you've started speaking about sandwich economics and the role of AI and algorithms along with humans in value creation. And you kind of worked on that, and your new book Reshuffle is focused on these topics. And so it's great to have you here, and I'd love to dive in and kind of unpack this.
My pleasure. Looking forward to talking to you.
Yeah, wonderful. So just to start out, I think, do you want to give some context, like, what has what led you to this? So your foundation, your motivation for doing this.
All the work that I do kind of stems from just trying to understand how do you win when the environment around you starts changing. And that's something that's been happening increasingly more over the last 15 years or so. So 15 years back, when, a lot of what we now call platform business models were coming up, I started out by trying to understand what exactly are the new rules of competition? How is competitive strategy changing? What sources of competition no longer apply? Which ones, which new sources come up? So essentially just understanding what are the counterintuitive factors based on which companies are winning. Like today, some of these things are very obvious, but 15 years back, people used to use simplistic framings like if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. Now, it might sound interesting, but that's not the full story of what these companies are doing. It's a bit like today people have simplistic framings like AI won't take your job, but somebody using AI will take your job. A lot of this sounds meme-worthy and sounds, somewhat correct, but it lacks vigor, it lacks nuance in terms of what are the various forces at play. So really, my first field of work was really to kind of unpack what the business models of the 2010s were really doing differently from before, and that's what I called out as platforms. My books, Platform Revolution and Platform Scale, are some of the foundational works on this topic. Definitely the most widely read works, and over the years, I worked on all three sides of the table, helping investors figure out which platforms work well, helping traditional companies move towards platform business models, and helping regulators figure out how to think about regulation in this new economy, because the traditional models of regulation don't necessarily apply. And what we're seeing now is sort of, to me, it's a continuation of that whole thesis, because a lot of people, when they look at AI, they think of automation and AI, automating workflows, agentic execution, and things of that sort. But to me, fundamentally, all value that is created in the digital economy comes down to one simple principle. It basically comes down to taking an information poor, fragmented space and filling it with data and creating entirely new value around that data, and hence coordinating all the players better using data. So that's what platforms did, right? It would take an information poor, fragmented space. If you had an extra room in your house, there was no information about it and nobody could access it. But Airbnb put information on it in the form of a rating system and then put it on a network so that everybody could access it. So the combination of the rating system and the network allowed fundamentally new transactions to happen. Today, AI does something very similar, where a lot of unstructured data just lies around, and Zoom calls, meetings, contracts, things that nobody is working with, a lot of things that are sitting in as tacit knowledge in people's brains. When all of this starts getting organized, you can then start creating fundamentally new interactions that did not exist in the past. And with that, you can start organizing systems much better. So really thinking about how technology helps reorganize systems and creates fundamentally new value, not just automation, not just efficiency. That's really at the heart of a lot of the work that I do. So that's, sort of the connecting thread between the work I did with platforms and the issues that I'm looking at today.
So it might be platforms then, reshuffle now. but the connection remains. How do you take opportunities, assets, information, whatever you want to call it, out there and create value out of that, right?
Yeah, especially how do you look at
Would that be a
fragmented
right?
systems, which, yes, there are two aspects to it. There's the fact that the system is fragmented. If the system is very organized, then there's no problem, right? It means that, if it's just an industry with three players, whether there's information or not, the industry works in a certain way and it's just three players, so they can easily coordinate. But if a system is fragmented, as most systems are, and if there's no information, then it means there's a lot of inefficiency over there. The right supply is not meeting the right demand. The right decisions do not have the right data. So there's tons of inefficiencies over there. And so typically what happens in such an inefficient system is people benefit a lot from local arbitrage. So you'll have a broker come in somewhere, take a bit of information from some sellers, a bit of information from some buyers, and create some arbitrage around it. So it's not an efficient system. And that is where, when you solve these problems around not just operational and task efficiency, but really system level problems, you can unlock fundamentally new value. So that's really at the heart of it.
So the network aspect and removing arbitrage, right? I think that's the other
That's right.
component. So there's one thing I think I have to ask you, because the word AI gets thrown around a lot, and as someone who studied math and specialized in machine learning and kind of saw AI mean different things just in my short career, AI went from everything that was, statistical learning, regressions, etc., and rule-based systems, right, to deep learning and then reinforcement learning, and now it's LLMs. And so, how would you define, what do you think is a good, rigorous, usable definition of AI that will still be relevant in a decade? Or do you like to define and frame things differently? Like, how do you go about being rigorous?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I'll look at two ways to approach the problem, right? Because when you talk about AI in terms of, machine learning, reinforcement learning, etc., we're talking about one aspect, which is learning, right? Learning is just one property of intelligent systems. There are other properties. There is perception, there is representation of the knowledge, there is reasoning, and then there's learning, and then there's execution, right? So if I think of any system as having those, any intelligent system as having those five broad parts, I would say that whether we call it AI or not, any intelligent system has those five broad parts: a way to perceive what's happening, sense and perceive what's happening, a way to represent your knowledge of the world, usable knowledge of the world, a way to reason with it, and then a way to learn and a way to execute. And, by that logic, there are many systems which have different levels of intelligence. And if I take a very simple example, Google Maps, GPS is the perception mechanism. The mapping data is the knowledge that it has. But then it also takes navigation data in real time. So all of that is the knowledge that it's basing on. And then it has a reasoning engine, which is how do you do routing, the route calculation mechanisms. And then it has a learning mechanism. The more data points it learns from, the better it gets at navigation. And it has an execution. In the past, you would have somebody sitting next to you reading a map. And instead of that, now you have the Google Maps lady taking you turn by turn. So somebody sitting next to you was also using the same things. They were seeing, they had perception, they had a map, which was the knowledge, representation. They were reasoning in their head, and then they were learning based on all the drives that they had done. And then they were executing agentically, if you will. They were exercising their agency in helping you navigate. So what I'm trying to say is that, if we move away from just the learning part of it, because the whole AI community focuses on the learning part of it. They say, okay, that was machine learning. This is deep learning. This is reinforcement learning. That's the learning part. Any intelligent system has those five parts, right? And now with those five parts, you can break them into different forms of, you can break them into different forms based on the nature of learning, based on the nature of representation, based on the nature of execution that plays out, right? So agentic AI, if people say, they're talking about the execution part. There's more agency. It's less assistive. It's more agentic. So that's the way I like to think about, intelligence in general. But a more, a separate usable way to think about intelligence is to think about technologies in general. When we say technologies very often, in our mind, we have two things. We're either talking about industrial technologies like a steam engine or the car's engine, petrol powered engine and so on, or we're talking about information technologies that help you process information, make better decisions and so on. But if you really think about our world, our organizations, our world of work, etc., we are influenced more by two other types of technologies, which are social technologies and cultural technologies. Now, social technologies have existed for a long time. And even if you look at a Facebook Connect, even if you look at Instagram, these are all social technologies as well. So they were brought into the digital world. But fundamentally, a social technology helps organize social systems better. And the cultural technology helps us make better meaning of what exists out there, right? So a map is a cultural technology. It helps you make better meaning of the world. A clock is a cultural technology. It helps you make better meaning of time, right? Now, the reason cultural technologies are important is because they determine who holds power and who does not hold power. A simple example of this is that um, people have power over you right now because you have a calendar that they can book stuff on. And so using the clock and the calendar, which are cultural technologies, which are ways to understand and make meaning of time, they exercise power on you, right? And if you work at a company, people have all the power over you with the time that you are there because it's through that technology, right? And similarly, maps create power because you can draw a line on a map and say, this side is my country, that side is your country. And so you set up power. So the reason I'm saying all of this is when we think about AI, we are not just talking about information technology. We're talking about social technologies, new ways in which workflows can be executed, new ways in which users can be organized, but more importantly, cultural technologies, because generative AI, for instance, takes a lot of information and creates new representations of the world, and then gives you new representations and helps you make meaning in fundamentally new ways, right? So if you were in an organization in the past or even today, the way you would make meaning or sense of what's happening in the organization is using a very old technology called meetings. You would go into a meeting room, meet other people, and make sense of what's happening, what different teams are doing, and find consensus. Now, if all those teams could feed a single AI model with all of their information, I could just query that model and understand and make meaning of what those different teams are doing as it applies to my workflow. And that's what increasingly is happening. If you use a Microsoft Copilot, for instance, and other teams are feeding into it, you're sort of using that to make meaning. So the meeting has been replaced, or the Slack chat has been replaced by a new form of meaning making. So what I'm trying to say with this is that when we talk about AI, let's not look at just the learning part, which is an engineering way of looking at it. Let's look at A, how to think about intelligence in general, but B, how do our systems get transformed, get changed? Because intelligence, in particular with AI, is a new form of cultural technology, a new socio-cultural technology. And so what does that mean in terms of how our systems get reorganized around it, how our organizations get reorganized around it? There are different angles from which you can come at this to really make sense of how to think about the impact of AI on the systems that we are a part of, whether it's a single workflow, whether it's a job, whether it's an organization, a contract. These are all different, systems within which you can look at how AI influences the system.
Yeah, no, what I really like about what you said is that you're not trying to define AI from a technology perspective, but from an outcome perspective, like what it results in, right, and how. And I think the other point was when you say the industrial technology, you're talking basically about the world of atoms, right? And then you're talking of information technology that's that's bits. And then there's humans. I think it's the interaction, the flow of information between these three kind of these three nodes, right? That affects what's going on, and that is where arbitrage opportunities show up. That is where your fragmentation, etc. Correct. So you'll really kind of building that abstraction of understanding how information flows.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then perhaps I mean, just because, there's just so much hype going on, and I think it's something that annoys me a lot also is like where people are not trying to speak rigorously or not thinking from first principles. What's your general, just kind of on a lighter note, how do you see hype and how do you see it being used to achieve, by some people to achieve certain outcomes? Like, what's your general take on hype?
Yeah, so I think, I have a very practical take on it. The thing is, if you look at how technological advancement happened in the past, the government used to play a big role. The traditional institutional mechanisms of funding used to play a big role. And that was largely because the world was relatively stable and things did not change as fast as they do right now. And because of that, you could rely on institutional mechanisms to kind of fund really long, moonshot projects, if you will, right? What happens today is whether you look at what's happening in space right now in terms of space exploration, what's happening with AI, what's happening with energy and geoengineering, these are all fundamentally new spaces. Or before this, electrification and electric vehicles, these are all new spaces where you have to solve a cold start problem. And what I mean by that is you don't just build a product, you have to align all the players in the ecosystem to come together to work in sync in order to achieve outcomes. And what that means is that if you want to, for example, build the electric vehicle ecosystem, you want advances in battery technology, you want charging systems to be up and ready, you want the vehicles to be there, you want all of these things to start moving in parallel. You want, batteries to be at home. And so you need multiple players to start working together in parallel. And the same thing is happening with AI right now. The thing is that when you need to solve this kind of a cold start problem where you are not just bringing yet another product in the market, you're kind of energizing the whole ecosystem, you have to solve a coordination problem, right? You have to kind of get everybody excited about this is something worth working on. And I think a lot of hype by the AI guys is in solving that problem because they know that, in game theory, there's a classic thing called the stag hunt, right? Which is that if two of you go out hunting into the forest, either you can both go and hunt rabbits on your own and individually do well, or you can work together and try to hunt a big stag, right? So the point is that if you coordinate your efforts, you can go after the bigger kill. And when you try to build something like the next big AI model, or you're trying to get a whole electric vehicle ecosystem off the ground, it's sort of a zero if all or nothing or all kind of a thing. You can't just say, I'll build the best battery, and even if the vehicle is not ready, I would have built the best battery, right? You need everything to come together. So when you have that kind of a coordination problem, you use hype as a mechanism to bring everybody onto the same, kind of get everybody to jump onto the same train and move in the same direction. And that's, in a way, what is happening right now. I don't think any of the model builders actually believe that in 1 year or 2 years' time, all the coders will go away. I think they don't really believe that. It's sort of a vector that they have to point to and say, this is where things are headed. If you're going to give us money, if you're going to come with us, if you're going to work with us, we can make it happen. And then even if it doesn't happen, it's a shifting target. We've seen that all the time. But if you don't create that kind of coordination, then you end up with the stag hunt problem, right? You were not able to go after the stag. You went home with the rabbit. That's not enough. And so it kind of leaves you nowhere. So I think that's really what these folks are trying to do. But I mean, personally, I'm very positive about the trajectory of AI because one thing that's very clear is that the AI that you and I are using today is the worst AI that we'll get going forward. It's only getting better from here. And we've seen this. If you look at, 10 months back, the internet was full of jokes about how AI could not draw good images, and images have, people have 10 fingers on each hand in those images and things of that sort. AI had a hands problem. But then, ChatGPT came out with 4 Sigma, and the image generation is really accurate. It's really good. And I now see designers posting, the same designers who were making fun of it 10 months back, making fun of mid-journey images, are now posing serious questions that my clients has stopped asking me to build these designs because they're getting better designs, so they're getting faster, cheaper designs directly from the model. So I think my point is that it's a trajectory that's constantly improving. We're already seeing the benefits. The hype is to coordinate the resources to move even faster, and also to prevent your competitors from getting the same resources.
Mhm. Yeah, I like this perspective because uh, what it does is, I mean, basically you have two equilibrium, right? You have an equilibrium where no one's interested and nothing's happening, or you have everyone kind of get together to make it happen. And
Mm-hmm.
and then hype, you're saying, is basically a way to grab attention, because attention is scarce, I think, increasingly in a noisy world. So you want to grab the attention, you want to then coordinate. Once you've got the attention, you want to coordinate people towards something, and then hopefully achieve at least a small percentage of it. Because if you don't do that, then I think that hype can also destroy trust, right? Just as it can get people
Right.
excited, I think could also destroy trust. How do you see that part? Like, like, just based on the last 2 years of this LLM kind of wave, uh, how do you see hype having created or destroyed trust? What are the risks, and what should people, kind of keep in mind?
Yeah, I don't think hype has destroyed trust with the LLM wave, but it has certainly destroyed trust just before that, for example, with crypto, in between with the metaverse. So it's important to kind of figure out where the hype is justified, where it's not justified. There's a big challenge also with hype that, even when there's real progress happening, and there are folks who are really building stuff and are creating hype so that they can get more momentum, there are also other folks who jump onto that and start selling snake oils and try to make a quick buck. So you need to be careful, during a period of hype. You need to be careful about that. But because we are in a world where traditional institutional mechanisms no longer work, right? I mean, government funding is not going to give you the next big AI model. If it did, Norway would have the next big AI model, or Europe would have many great AI models, but they don't right now. And institutional mechanisms are not really working in this world. At the same time, we are seeing new ways of fundamentally changing the economics of different industries. The economics of space have completely changed. The economics of energy have changed over time. So when we see this sudden change in economics, which means that you are able to produce much without the constraints of the past, but in order to do that, you need to get a whole ecosystem to come together. The opportunity is too big to ignore. Yet at the same time, you can't do it yourself. So you create that hype to bring everyone together, and that's what we see. Even with things like SpaceX, if you really look at the big bang launches and so on. I mean, uh, Elon Musk, in a way, even before Altman and others, Elon Musk is sort of the quintessential leader of this attention-starved, hype-heavy era, right? If we look at him from traditional leadership metrics, he is, really not a great leader and all of that stuff, but he's the leader that that this time deserves, because we are in a time which is attention hungry and opportunity rich, and hence needs to be hype heavy in order to funnel attention and resources towards those opportunities.
It's interesting you say that, because personally, I got my driver's license only 2 years ago, because I gave a lot of benefit of doubt, especially to Musk, among others, saying, we'll have full self-driving cars. So I said, why should I bother learning to drive? But that, for example, destroyed a lot of trust with me personally, because I was like, finally, I need to do it myself. Uh, but but yeah, no, I think, I think you're right. I think sometimes you just have to punt and give it a shot, and some of them work, and you just need, I think, one or two to work, and it doesn't matter if the other ones, kind of fizzle out. Um, you mentioned the economics changing. Can we do you want to dive in there kind of deeper, and elaborate on that? Like, how are the economics changing? Why is that relevant? And how can people act based on that? Like, how do you bake that into your strategy?
Yeah, so I think when I talk about economics changing, it's the most effective way in which we've seen that is, um, well, the fundamental idea behind economics changing is that something that used to be expensive in the past, and hence was not done much or accessed much because it was expensive, suddenly becomes cheap. And when that becomes cheap, you start using it much more, because of which entire systems change. So a very simple example, you're writing about data. Data was expensive in the past, right? It was expensive to connect data. It was expensive to maintain data. And it was expensive to use that data because all of that data sat in spreadsheets and on pen and paper. And once digital technologies came in, it got cheaper to capture data. It got cheaper to manage and use data at scale, and it got cheaper to leverage it to make decisions. So what ended up happening was better decisions, better markets were created, and you see, the effects of that in everything, ranging from how sports is played today to how trading happens in markets to how something like Airbnb comes in, these are all different manifestations of data becoming cheaper, right? And so in a similar way, access to more complex sources of knowledge and what was typically tacit knowledge becomes cheaper with AI, because if we're recording this podcast, it's going to be on YouTube at some point. YouTube will transcribe it. The moment it transcribes it, it can be read by any AI model, and then that can be fed into any workflow and can be used over there. All of this could not happen in the past between two people who were speaking, and that conversation would just, all of the data would be created. It would not be usable. So my point is that when the cost of using something drops, it gets used not just more, but in fundamentally new ways. And when it gets used in fundamentally new ways, the entire system changes. Because if there was a system where, decisions were not being made often enough, and hence things were, things were moving slowly. Just take a simple example. If somebody is suffering from a long-term terminal illness, in the past, they would have to visit the doctor once a month or once a week or whatever. And those episodic visits would be the point at which data would be taken about them and a decision would be made. But now they can strap something on their wrist and stream that data in real time to doctors who are, telepresent, and get information in real time about how they should be monitoring themselves. So when that access to data and the access to the resulting decision becomes cheap, you end up doing it much more. When you end up doing it much more, the way you manage your health changes, the outcomes change. It's not just that the number of decisions you're getting changes, the entire outcome changes, and with that, the larger system around it changes. And so I think that's the key idea with plummeting economics in any scenario.
Yeah, and so I think understanding this, having a systems understanding is super critical, thinking from first principle and saying what is changing, right? And because any plan or any long-term investment made without this understanding of the system is bound to fail, right? Unless, because you might not necessarily know exactly how the system is changing, but what you can rely on is the fact that it is changing. And this is something that I always argue for, which is trying to think about, like, when you're planning something longer term, let's say, a flywheel that you want to build for 10 years, you really want to obsess about those things that don't change. So what are your thoughts on that? Because at the end of the day, there's some fundamental things that don't change. And how do you see understanding the system on a shorter term basis, but then having a North Star, having a direction that will not change for a decade, let's say?
Yeah, so I think there's a very structured way to think about it, actually, and that is that any system has multiple moving parts, components, right? Some of these components work well together and reinforce each other. They are called complementary, and because of that complementarity, you get that flywheel effect, right? At the same time, systems have what are called constraints, because of which the system does not move fast enough, right? You can call it a constraint, you can call it a bottleneck. These are the things that limit system performance. So what we're essentially saying is that in any system, there's certain things that just do not change over time, right? If you're talking about a market system where consumers are purchasing, you might just say that a consumer's need to feel secure just does not change because it's one of those Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You need to solve your security problem. So if you give to the consumer something based on which they feel secure, they are going to buy it, right? So you are then basing your idea around something that does not change, which is fine. That's one part of the system that does not change. At the same time, you can think about, what were the constraints in that system? Maybe, in the past, there was a constraint that there was no way to solve the security problem of the consumer because the consumers felt insecure because they did not know whether they were going to be cheated. And now suddenly you have enough data to create a reputation system about different sellers based on which you can say, okay, this is a good seller, this is not a good seller. And so you solve the consumer's security problem, something that never changes, with cheaper data, something that has changed just now and has solved a constraint because of which now you're able to solve that problem for many more consumers. In the past, if you had to do the same thing, the answer would have been a local broker who would personally go and talk to 6 sellers, charge a big premium in the middle for the security problem that they were solving. So the economics of solving the security problem has changed, but the security problem in itself has not changed. So, that's one way to think about it. I mean, any system has components. Certain components will just not change. Certain components will change. But if the change is impacting the constraints in the system, which were keeping it locked, that I think is very powerful, because then you can rely on what does not change, figure out how to fix this constraint, and then solve that thing which does not change on an ongoing basis, and capture the rewards of that.
Yeah, I think that kind of feeds into what you speak about when you say the pie will grow over time. And then you need to kind of, so like the core problem stays, and the core problem of trust, let's say, is eternal. But then how you solve for that trust changes. And especially with fewer arbitrage opportunities, with everything become cheaper, you can scale stuff faster. And so I think, how about we delve into this idea of the opportunities have increased, but who kind of benefits from those opportunities and how they benefit from those opportunities becomes super critical, right?
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting point, because we we often get into these two extremes, where one camp says it's all hype, nothing is going to grow, nothing new is going to happen. The other camp says that everything is going to grow, everybody's going to be much better, the world is going to be a great place, right? And the reality actually is that the pie consistently grows, but it does not get divided equally. And this is something that we've seen happening for at least 45 years now. So starting in the 1980s, when we started seeing the financialization of industries, we started seeing much more extraction happening in certain directions. Those who owned capital and dealt with capital and moved capital around, whether they were the industrialists or the financiers, or just the traders, they ended up making much more than labor, right? And so we started seeing that happen quite a bit. That has today taken on a different shape, where instead of the distinction being financial extraction versus labor, we are in a place where we're seeing algorithmic extraction versus labor. So think of Uber. The data scientist at Uber earns maybe 10 to 50 times what the driver at Uber earns, right? And that's not so much because they're doing something that is 10 to 50 times more difficult. It's not a labor equation. It's really an extraction equation, because the pie is growing on account of both of those forces. The data scientist is changing the system. The driver is actually creating value in the system, but the value is fully moving in one direction. And so this ability to constantly slice, the pie in favor of certain people and away from certain people, it's actually not reversed. It's actually gotten even deeper as the pie has grown. And so I think recently this came out that, yesterday or the day before, that we've now crossed 3,000 billionaires. And that was not true 10 years back, certainly a much smaller number 20 years back. At the same time, we have much more homelessness. We have, tons of different markers of stagnating or even decelerating or decreasing, real incomes in real terms, compared to what incomes were for the middle class some time back. So I think the key point over here is that technology constantly helps us grow the pie. It does not always help us slice the pie in a way that's equal. And if you look at the AI example again that we're talking about, with AI coming in, the pie is about to grow even more, right? It's already starting to happen. But how that pie will be sliced will be determined by who wins the different battles. So I'll tell you a few different battles that are going to be played out, right? One battle is between you and the machine. So if you had a job where you did a bundle of 15 different tasks, even if the machine does not replace you, if it can do 10 of those tasks very well, you won't get paid that well for the remaining 5 tasks. In some cases, you might, because they are the most valuable tasks and the machine cannot come for them. If you're a CEO, for instance, and your decisions are most valuable and that intuition matters, or a very high-end surgeon, maybe the machine cannot come for those things. But for many other jobs, the machine will come for those 10 tasks, and your ability to charge for the remaining will go down. Will you get to charge for it will also go down. What could happen is there may be no reason to justify a full-time role for you inside a company, so you now become a freelancer. So your location of charging will also go down, which then means your economics of how your business works becomes different. So, that's one tension, right? At the same time, there will be solopreneurs who'll use all this AI to scale their business really well. So they'll benefit in a different way. That's one tension that will determine who wins, who loses. Another tension, for instance, is between the companies that are building AI and the actual, players in the industry, whether consulting firms or legal firms, the solution providers who are going to deploy that AI. And this tension we've already seen between the self-driving companies and the automotive companies. And we've seen this in many different industries between a John Deere and the farmer. But the same thing is now going to happen in many more knowledge-intensive industries as well. So to the extent to which, the tool providers move into the solution, or the solution providers fight back and move into building tools themselves, who gets to capture how much will depend on issues like that. So these are the types of tensions based on which, even if the pie grows, it may not be split equally. A very simple example is what sort of happened in farming. So in farming, John Deere used to just sell tractors, right? And every farm relied on local knowledge because every farm has either a different geography, the soil profile is different, the weather is different, and so on. But now, using sensors and using tons of data, John Deere captures all of that information. So in the past, you had agricultural consultants, you had local consultants and brokers who would help the farmer manage the farm better. Now all of them are out of business, and basically between a company like John Deere and the large insurance companies, these companies capture all of the data and are able to best price risk with a particular farm and are able to capture most of the value around the farm produce, right? So these are the examples where you see that the pie is growing, but it gets skewed in a certain direction and it gets consolidated in a certain direction, which means that the others don't benefit from the growing pie. You could argue that the smaller farmers across, the US in particular, have not benefited from the agricultural revolution to the extent that John Deere and insurance companies have. So those are, things that come up even with the growing pie.
That's something very interesting because what we're coming back to is kind of the fundamental unit of value creation. I something interesting because you spoke about start with the industrial paradigm and then move forward to now, and then you went to agriculture. And was researching my book, I went back to hunting. So I looked for anthropological studies of tribes that exist today and how they hunt. That's very interesting because there it's like per unit of labor, how many calories of meat do you get, right? And you typically
Right.
think, it's
Yeah.
groups of 20 men with spears, going and killing big mammals. But that's just the success rates for such hunts are between 1 and 10%. And, depending on geography and time of the year and all that. But like broadly, 50, 60% of all calorie intake was based on traps. And traps are a kind of first form of scalable, cheap automation, right? And then you have a portion of about 30%, 40%, depending on the region. That was these big mammals, right? The stag hunt or even bigger, like we're talking, I don't know, elephants or something like that. And
Right.
then you have 10%, which is opportunistic, opportunistic scavenging, because what people did was they would let the primary predator, when there was a primary predator, like a lion, tiger, or even wild dogs, kill the animal, and then they would chase the primary predator away. And so the unit of value was like, okay, for every unit of labor, how much calories am I getting out of it? Meat, right? When you move into agriculture, it is like, the interesting part is I think the labor component becomes less critical compared to hunting. The land part, because at the end of the day, you're planting the seed, you're taking care of it, you're harvesting, but like the magic is happening by, nature is doing the magic, and land is the kind of fundamental unit of value creation. This is something that Daniel Priestley speaks a lot about, because here's when you go from there to the industrial age, now suddenly it's capital, right? Access to capital, what you said, machinery, and component labor, which you kind of put in to produce goods. So the unit of value goes from land to to machines to access to finance, etc. And so when taxing land, so you have the French Revolution because too many people
Yep.
had too much land. Then you shift, suddenly the land-based taxation becomes irrelevant in an industrial age, because it doesn't matter how much land you have. It matters, like how good your supply chains are, how much machinery and access to capital you have. And then you move into kind of the digital world, of computers, the early internet. And like you said, now it's really about the unit of how much value can you extract from the data you have, right? Uh, is that a correct characterization? Do you want to add some nuance to this?
Yep. No, I think
Uh,
you know that's certainly one of the aspects at play in terms of sort of um, the lens that you're talking about is in very very crude terms, it's sort of a return on effort or return on investment kind of a lens, but and that's certainly one of the aspects at play. And I think in general, whenever we are looking at these issues, we have to look at what happens at the level of the component, what happens at the level of a system, right? So even if I take your hunting example, the way a lone hunter would make decisions would be different from the way a hunter friending for a family of five versus a hunter hunting in a pack of five would make decisions, right? So you always need to make those choices at those two
portfolio.
levels. Yeah, yeah, exactly, right? Because the moment the moment you get to what I would call is the bundle, right? Whether you call it a portfolio or the bundle, there are certain interactions that start coming in. One interaction is the cross subsidization. Somebody can do a little less because somebody else is doing a little more, but the whole team wins. So there are new interactions that start coming in, and mm, I think even if I take the hunting example, like right, if you are a pack of five people, you can just hunt longer and go farther because, as a simple example, somebody can keep watch at night while the other four sleep, so that wild animals don't attack, and then you can walk further the next day. So there are many interactions that come in once the system starts coming into view.
Yeah, no, totally. The other interesting point based on what you said was this idea of the tension developing. So between the person providing labor, the person kind of, paying for labor, right? And also between
Mhm.
the vendor, the existing value creator, let's call them traditional, legacy, whatever you want to call it. Right? I think you used the term traditional business, I use legacy business, but like at the end, it's the same thing. It's the guy in between providing the current value and then the customer. And I use this anecdote in the book from Charlie Monk. I think you have it also on one of your blog posts, right? With the when someone ran in and said, hey, there are these new mills, textile mills, and it's become so much more efficient. And basically Warren Buffett says, I think if it's true, we'll exit the textile business because that
Right.
that value that we're actually capturing is going to shrink. So what are
Yeah.
your thoughts on like um, traditional legacy businesses when they think about engaging with vendors? Because I see a lot of naivety there where people think they can buy their way to success, like, oh, we'll buy this solution, we'll take this off the shelf, and the more we spend money on tooling and assume that tooling is going to create more value, and that of course doesn't work. And so like,
Yeah.
what's your take on that? And
Yeah. So I think, two things are important, right? You cannot, um, you cannot sell the performance of the tool that you're using. What I mean by that is you cannot say we are a better consulting company because we are now using ChatGPT. That means that you're not adding sufficient value on top to be the differentiator. And the player underneath you, the tool provider, has wholesale transfer pricing power. They can basically, if you increase your prices, they can increase their prices. I mean, this is the classic Netflix problem, right? The Netflix problem is when Netflix went from DVDs into online streaming, right? With DVDs, it had an advantage. It had the advantage of logistics. It was really very good at sending DVDs around the country in a way that nobody else would copy. And once it went into streaming, it realized that people would come in based on the catalog of movies that they had. But if they did not create their own movies, then the more successful Netflix would get, the movie providers would keep renegotiating. But as anybody who has run an online business will know, the value is not just in the movies. A lot of the value is in how well you are able to retain the customer. So all the success that Netflix would have based on its ability to retain the customer would have moved back to the movie provider. And that's why Netflix had to go into production itself to kind of not get into that trap. So the same thing kind of, applies over here, because as a streaming company, you're not really selling 100, GBPS streaming or anything of that sort. What you're selling is the catalog of movies you have, right? And if you do not control that, if you're dependent on somebody else for what you're selling, then it becomes a problem. And so that's the real issue. So the streaming example is simple to understand because that's a classic distributor kind of relationship. But even if you take the consulting firm with ChatGPT example, if your improved performance is entirely because of what your tool is helping you do, then you have a problem. But if you're charging for something else, right? Let's say you don't do consulting, you provide these really beautiful, the treats for CEOs, and you use ChatGPT on the side to plan everything and to get the materials in place. But what the CEOs are paying for is not that. They're paying for their experience at, this tropical island where they get to learn from each other and all of that stuff. Then it's different. Then, what you're selling is not the tool's performance. The tool's performance helps your performance to then create some other value that you're selling. So it's very important to understand, what are you selling? Is it your performance or the tool's performance, right? And in general, the simplest way to think about it is to recombine, never sell the underlying tool's performance. Take that performance and combine it with 10 other things and create something new. Your ability to have pricing power is based on your ability to recombine and create something new.
Yeah, no, totally. I think when you see that in the music industry with Spotify, right, where earlier you try to sell DVDs as an artist, right, and as a musician, and kind of get people to pay you for the unit of time of music that they hear from you. And today, you put it all for free, doesn't matter. You get paid, you make your money in the concerts, right? That's the Taylor Swift effect around the world, and really a lot of money, right? That also shows you like a power dot developing very quickly. Because your ability to distribute, I think DVDs earlier was limited to local distribution and then perhaps online at some point, but with streaming, it's just one click away. I think the friction's gone away. Like you said, all this fragmentation is gone. And so you get very quickly power laws, and then the value creation really happens in the live events. This is also the example.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you bring music up, because music has the same issue. The pie has grown, but it's not sliced equally. Right. And there are like 3 or 4 different aspects because of which it is not sliced equally. Like if we take that example very quickly, because it's a very interesting one, music is very consolidated on the labels side, which is 3 labels own 75 to 80% of the music in the world. The best part is they did not have to spend a lot in order to get that music. What happened is when music got pirated, when Napster happened, a lot of the small labels went out of business. So they were bought on the cheap by the big labels. So the big labels never had to pay for those rights. They just got all of those rights on the cheap. Then they worked together to work with Spotify. So now Spotify cannot make a lot of money in between because the big labels make a lot of money over here. Artists get paid very little. So both Spotify and the artists are trying to figure out ways to kind of walk away from it and create their own thing. So Taylor Swift, in a way, to me, is sort of the exception that proves the rule in a really big way. Because yes, money moved to concerts. You're absolutely right. Because before that, you could make money selling music, but now when music became free, you could make money with concerts. But as we move towards, the current phase, Taylor Swift is a unique example who is making outsized returns, not just because value has moved from one thing to the other, but because she has figured out how to recombine value in a fundamentally new way. And she has figured out how to create agency around it, primarily through ownership of her own catalog by re-recording it and so on. But she repeatedly tries to see what the power relationships are, how they are shifting. With any new platform that comes up, she sees where the power relationships are setting up, and she tries to renegotiate and then recombine and create something in a fundamentally new way. So, this whole Eras tour is not a standard concert. It's a recombination. It's a larger experience. It's a concert with a Netflix thing, with something else. with a much larger experience as a fan. So I think that's really powerful. But then it just shows that the pie gets split unequally again. Only a few players can do that really well.
Yeah, no, I think, and since you said you work with regulators, I have to ask you this, right? Which is, um, when we moved from hunting to farming, then land ownership was the unit of value, right? And if it wasn't regulated or spread equally enough, right, then we have the French Revolution. I was on a in studio podcast in Paris, and I said, 300 years ago, chopping people's head off here, right? That, like, if you don't get that right, and it's not these binaries between, oh, it's extreme left, extreme right, or capitalism and communism, all that nonsense. I think it's more nuanced, like you said. It's not like the world is getting better or worse. It's just different, and things are changing. And so, from a regulator's perspective, if the unit of value creation is no longer labor, component labor getting paid, because you see these wages stagnating and collapsing, people blame it on, on, I don't know, lobbyism, on this and that, and corruption. I think there's definitely probably a bit of that, but it can't be the main driver. And I think that the fact is that today you can no longer, or let's say, exchanging labor, component labor in exchange for money is no longer a scalable, profitable way to create wealth, right? That has changed. And so when you speak with regulators, when you're thinking about regulating this, so that the system doesn't, no, so that we don't start chopping heads again, right? So, like, how do you think about that? What would you tell regulators, and why is it important to act, and what should be done?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of different things involved. Um, One is that if you want to regulate something, you should not be regulating it based on this is labor and this is not labor. Um, and this is not easy to do, but regulation should try to see how to align value capture with value creation, right? You can create a lot of value, but are you able to capture that value? That's the key point. I mean, I'll go back to the Uber driver and the Uber data scientist. The Uber data scientist is creating value, as is the Uber driver. But the data scientist is capturing a lot more value than he deserves, and the driver is capturing a lot less value than he deserves, right? So there's a mismatch over there, and the mismatch is happening because of a few factors. One is as simple as employment laws. The moment you classify them as a contractor, you're able to do away with a lot of the costs associated with a full-time employee, but that also means that they don't have social cover and so on. And that's just one of the factors based on which this is happening. In any algorithmically managed system, more of the value capture shifts to the center and more of the risk shifts towards the nodes, towards the edges, right? And those are the things that should be regulated more than anything. Like in today's world with AI coming in, very often we, you know, again, make these grand sweeping statements that, AI will flatten everything, the human touch will still matter. Or what do we mean by the human touch, right? Because there are many different things that are human touch, right? But the point is that not all of those things will be rewarded equally. I'll give a simple example. You go to a restaurant, okay? At a restaurant, you pay $400 for a bottle of wine. You go out and you go to the store. The same bottle would be available for $70 or $80. What are you paying that extra for? Typically, a restaurant that's charging $400 will have a sommelier who will come to your table, who will talk to you about the wine's history, about the sixth generation family that has been running that orchard and all of that stuff, the winery. And it's basically for that story, for how the style and how they make you feel that you're getting a fine dine experience. That's what you're paying the $320 for. You're paying it for that experience, right? So that's, if you say human touch is all of that style and experience, and you can't just become a sommelier, you have to go through a certification. So it's difficult to get there. That's true. But that's an example of you put a human in a commoditized space, because before World War II, wine was not a commodity. There were very few places that could grow wine. But after World War II, and especially with the rise of globalization, container shipping, etc., wine growing started happening in Australia, South America, everywhere. So wine became a commodity and value shifted to what the sommelier does. So that's, a human coming into a commoditized system and capturing value because of the unique, style and delivery and everything that they bring. Because frankly, whatever they tell you, you can also get from Chat GPT. It's more about the experience of the way it's delivered and way that's delivered and what that means from a status perspective. On the other hand, a whole population around the world is aging. They also need the human touch, which means that they will need helpers, they will need um, caregivers. Will the caregivers be able to charge $320 premium for 3 minutes of talking to the, to the to that elderly person? And I don't mean exactly that number or that unit of time and money. What I mean is that on this side, when we think about caregivers, we are very likely to end up with an Uber driver scenario where algorithms are determining which caregiver goes where, how much they get paid, and how they get squeezed progressively, just because so many people can become caregivers and because it becomes a highly competitive market. And more of their knowledge gets extracted into AI systems. While on the other hand, when you align the human touch with something that feels like luxury, you're able to capture much more over there. So I think that's the problem, right? This is what has to be regulated because value is being created both places, but the caregiver is not able to capture the value that they are creating. How can you regulate that? And regulation does not always have to happen at the level of a job, at the level of the work itself. It could just be wherever you are not seeing, value capture aligning with value creation. Are there other ways to funnel value back to them? Maybe it's through a tax mechanism, maybe it's through something else, but are there other ways to funnel value back to those people? I think those ultimately we have to regulate the movement of value rather than rather than the classification of work, if you will. I think that's what has to be really solved for.
Yeah, because I mean, work was the unit of value that was invested. Today, it's something else. But yeah, and it's interesting
Mhm.
because you see what you just described with care, or what might happen with caregivers, is very similar to the music industry. Is very similar if you go back to cocoa, to chocolate and cocoa markets, right? You have tons of farmers growing cocoa.
Right.
You have tons of retailers
Yeah,
selling chocolates. Have three or four, cocoa trading companies kind of capturing all the
that's right.
value.
Yeah.
Um, and then I guess, yeah, perhaps, I mean, do you also have something in your upcoming book on like how regulators should approach this, or is this something you plan to do more of later? This idea of how do you even how do you measure, how do you quantify, how do you create, legislate and create policy around defining what value is going in and what value is coming out?
Yeah. No, I think in my work, I try to get it to a point where I clarify what the framework should be and what questions you should be asking. If you get down to actual policy creation, there's also law. There's also multiple other aspects in terms of how you think about regulation. So I try to look at, are you regulating the right part of the system or not? Are you looking at the right problems? So I try to give a sense of, here's the system. Let's stop looking at the nature of work. Let's start looking at the flow of value. Let's start focusing our efforts over there. So that's typically where I leave the conversation. And then it becomes, folks who are running businesses can take that. Folks who are anticipating their own future at their jobs can take that framework. And then policymakers can take that framework. It's a way to think about it.
Nice. Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I mean, we also have a clear value proposition, right? That's important. Um, which and I think the next thing we can go there, like from economics and like the unit economics and strategies, then organization and change and people and like what changes there. And some ways, if you think about it, like Taylor Swift is basically the cocoa farmer in Ghana now building a direct relationship with, so like she's growing
Mhm.
the wine and she's the sommelier at the same time, and people are not paying for the wine, but they're paying for that sommelier experience in person.
Right.
And yeah, and in many ways, I think I mean, you're a multiple book published author. I'm just getting started, but I think today you don't make money selling books anymore, right? It's like you providing that value for free. Similarly, these podcasts, earlier you might get paid to go on TV. Today you do podcasts, you discuss with a wide variety of people across the internet with different points of view, etc. You might have never met before, you might never meet again, right? And so everyone's putting in that time and spreading the message because you don't charge anymore for the idea, right? You capture value somewhere
Yeah.
else. But like,
Yeah.
and
I was
so
just
yeah,
saying
on the
that,
organization.
I kind of I kind of think of it as, the natural evolution of the information economy we are in, right? Because when information was limited, you could capture value in owning stocks of information. If you had a lot of information, you could capture value by licensing it, right? Today, stocks of information are not very valuable because information changes very fast. The cost of generating information is very low. Anybody can create a stock of information and so on, right? The cost of generating wrong information is actually lower than the cost of verifying whether the information is true. And misinformation hacks your attention even better. So the information economics have moved away from stocks and moved completely towards flows. So I really feel that increasingly, this traditional model of copyright protection, all of that was based on the stock side of the world. And we are moving to a world where value has shifted to flows. And over here, you can't rest on saying, I've created this information and I'm going to charge for it. You have to constantly keep moving, constantly keep being in the flow of information, which means that value is really going to be in two things: always interpreting what's happening and making sense of it, and then applying it in a specific context. Those are the two places where value is going to be. Because everything in between, which is capturing the information, managing the information, synthesizing the information, AI is already doing that really well. It's more interpretation and application in specific contexts that is lacking. And a lot of us in the education system, we've been not necessarily been taught to interpret and apply. We've been from our childhood taught to kind of capture, store, and synthesize information. That's how testing works. And, you could say that, well, in a business school, and Harvard Business School case study is testing your application, but I would disagree. Today, if you upload an HBS case study into ChatGPT and ask it the same questions, it will give you actually better answers than any student can, because it knows everything in the case and it knows everything that's happened, and it has analyzed many such things before with all the information it has. It gives really good answers in terms of the case. So you realize that when you're solving a case, you're not really applying information, you're synthesizing information. And that is, I think that is what's not valuable anymore. It's the interpretation and application that's valuable.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that's why it's really important to think from first principles, right? Anything, it's the ability to, like you said, to adapt to situations. Because I use this example of like a physical industrial product. The experience, whether it's a book, your book someday when someone buys it, right, once it's launched, or a car or whatever. These are all physical products where a decision before, you kind of see, okay, how is the driving experience? How is the audio? And so you experience it in a multi-dimensional way. Digital products structurally are unidimensional in time, meaning I have a user journey, right? Meaning like if the third click is already so bad and I haven't got value, I don't care what the average user journey over time, the time average does not matter, right? It's like, what's the nuisance threshold, and am I constantly creating value along that? And interestingly, the book, a physical book is a physical product that you can't change after you ship, but then while reading it, it's like a linear digital user journey. It's not digital, but it's like a user journey where, if chapter 2 is awful, but chapter 8, 9, 10 are amazing, no one's going to get there. They probably just put the book aside. That's why it's so challenging to write a book. And the third thing, right, so like replication costs go down, etc., when you go digital. And then the data-driven digital, right, where you have then personalization costs also go to zero. And so, like you said, it's not even around the user journey. It's like the rate at which you can personalize to that user journey. So you're looking at the second derivative in some ways of value creation. So it's not just creating value, the copyright or whatever, like the industry, like, publishing a book is irrelevant now. It's not just about writing a good book that's engaging. It's like, can you also personalize and create value constantly, right?
Yep, absolutely. And I think we don't know the answers yet. What I was trying to say is that I don't think we know the answers yet in terms of where value is going to shift, right? Even if you look at, the classic case of people looking at Mid-Journey and laughing at the kind of images that were being made, and now people looking at Four Sigma and saying, my clients are using this to make images. We don't yet know the trajectory that future AI is going to take. It's not going to be just LLMs. It's going to be new AI systems, new compound systems based on which we are able to solve fundamentally new problems, right? And the thing is that from here on, And I think this journey started quite some time back. But from here on, we have to constantly reinvent and rethink what we are doing, and ask that question on a daily basis, because there's going to be no point in trying to do what the machine does better than the machine. Even if the machine is not that good today, it'll become way better tomorrow. So a year back, ChatGPT was really bad at writing. It's now way better, and in a year it'll become incredibly better. It'll soon start not sounding like AI, right? And so once you get to that point, you have to really think more carefully about what you should be doing, um, and what is it that you can do, which is, going back to your point, something that never changes. Because if you have to constantly keep jumping from being a blockchain expert to a prompt engineering expert, that's not going to help you. You're constantly going to be jumping from one thing to the other. So you really have to think about what is it about you that simply does not change, or what is it about your worldview that is unchangeable, and can you bet on that? I think that's going to be critical.
At the end, it's this question of what value are you putting in, what value are you getting out, right? And how do you fit into that
Mm-hmm.
system? Uh, yeah. Is there anything, because like the way that I think there's a lot, the news cycle changes all the time. So we could discuss about the global and geopolitical implications, but sometimes I feel like over time, that will become very stale, right, compared to the much more fundamental ideas we discussed. I think so.
Yeah.
But if you want to comment on something, feel free. And otherwise, I would suggest, how that we get into this idea of human differentiation, and I think, from inanimate matter to plants to animals to chimpanzees and apes, right, to us. I think we broadly have this feeling of intelligence, the most the apex intelligent species on the planet, and in a very philosophical, almost spiritual sense, I think for the first time we have algorithms that can do stuff that we thought only we could. And I have a funny story from 2016 when I was just finishing grad school in Paris, and
Mm-hmm.
we had a probabilistic models class where we had to kind of research a certain topic and present it. And one of my classmates ended his little presentation by saying, like, we've made a lot of progress in reinforcement learning, but go far away from like humans will continue being better than machines. And the next day,
Right.
there was the press release from DeepMind, and Lee Sedol had been beaten by AlphaGo.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I really liked what you said. Was this kind of candid, rigorous humility of saying, hey, it's not about making a statement that'll hold for 10 years. It's really about rethinking, reinterpreting, and coming back, like, this kind of almost Bayesian approach of constantly updating your parameters. So, but like,
Yeah.
on these two ideas, right, on us being the apex intelligent species and how we look at ourselves in the right, and how we look at each other and how we work together, and what it means to be human, right, along with also being able to say something like, hey, I don't know. So do you want to kind of reflect and share what you think about that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the thing is, um, the thing is that we, we, humans are very intelligent and are capable of a lot, but they may not be applying that intelligence um, in a way that is uniquely human. Because when we keep saying uniquely human, human touch, right? I mean, if I go back to this point about collecting, managing, and synthesizing information versus interpreting and applying information. If you go through an education system and you go through a work system that constantly teaches you to collect, manage, and synthesize information, and never to interpret and apply information. Because if you really look at an organization, there's a very small minority of people who interpret and apply information. Others are actually collecting, managing, and synthesizing information. And this is, the distinction is quite subtle, because even if you're an engineer or a writer, you could just be collecting, managing, and synthesizing information. You might not be interpreting and applying information at all, which is actually the creative work. And if you're just doing those three things, you're not necessarily doing what makes you uniquely intelligent, right? A machine can collect, manage, and synthesize information much better. So I think that's a fundamental disconnect between how, as a society, we've tried to approach what our role is with respect to processing and making meaning out of things. If processing and making meaning has always been about collecting, managing, and synthesizing information, then machines are going to make meaning better than us. If we are to be uniquely human, we have to make meaning at a fundamentally different level, which comes through interpreting and applying information. And I think until, we uniquely understand where we are well suited to do that, we will constantly end up being in a race with the machine. So I think that is the key thing. It's very easy to give a cop-out answer like, humans will win or the human touch will always matter. But once you kind of dig below the surface and try to peel out the different variables, as you've also mentioned a few times today, once you think through those first principles, it becomes very clear where that quote unquote human touch is a liability and where it is actually a differentiator and an asset. And I think that is what all of us need to think about. It's really about what is that intuition that is just not absorbable? What is that intuition, that ability to interpret and apply that is unique to us? What kind of that intuition have we built that is just so unique that improvements in machine intelligence cannot just take that away? So I think that is important. Even in highly standardized tasks, right? Things where everything is very standardized, intuition still plays a very important role. Like, there are actual studies that show that surgeons perform much better in high precision surgeries in their home hospitals than when they are traveling, because they just have that connect with that team with whom they work day in, day out. It's just, it's imperceptible, that connect, right? And the same thing applies to, pilots who keep getting chained around with their co-pilot all the time, struggle much more, even though autopilot is actually, a reality. For self-driving is a reality when it comes to planes versus cars, but still that intuition matters. So really figuring out what that is.
Yeah, interestingly, one
Yeah.
of my professors was visiting the director of the machine learning program that I did a couple of years ago, and they already researched in France where they flew cargo planes end to end without pilots, like no one in the cockpit. And he said it's
Right.
like in it's doable. And because even landing and takeoff is completely autopilot, the only question was, what if something goes wrong, like when a system breaks? But then if you've seen the movie Sully, right, you realize
Yeah.
even there, uh, it's not black and white. Sometimes the human's probably doing something worse, right? So it's not
Yeah.
that easy. And I
Yeah.
think that's a great place to wrap up, because at the end of the day, we're now all of us going to be confronted with what it means to be human, and how we see ourselves and as a human being, and how we see others as human beings. I think in many interestingly, it takes us back to the most fundamental questions of mankind, right? Of humankind.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah.
But so let's wrap up on that note. Thank you so much, Sangeet. It was really a pleasure
Yeah.
talking to you.
My
Thanks a lot.
pleasure. It was a pleasure.